Again, picking up on a comment, an observation, a very astute one made by Diana Nemiroff. She mentioned that sometimes a more intense interest in Indigenous visual and cultural expression occurs at a time of crisis in Western art history. So my question is to you, what is the crisis in Western art history now?
I think that the crisis is the definition of it. And I'm also wanting to add like another question. Like after Sakahàn, what happens after Sakahàn? Like after this big blockbuster quinquennial exhibition, I want to know what's the next exhibition that's going to take over. The second question is the Inuit exhibition at the bottom floor, at the basement of this exhibition, of this gallery, is that a permanent exhibition or is it temporary? And the reason why I raise these questions is that I'm from Samoa, I'm from a Pacific island, I'm a diaspora of Samoa, I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I travel very actively. I base myself in Auckland and then I travel widely for my work. And there was this one time I was at the National Gallery of New South Wales. And what's really interesting about the structure of the Art Gallery of New South Wales is that all the Western classical art is at the top floor, and then the Indigenous art is at the bottom floor. So it's almost as if it echoes this kinds of like social Darwinist art hierarchy. So I'm just wanting to find out if any of the members of the staff from the National Gallery can explain, I just want to know, if the Inuit exhibition at the basement, whether if that's permanent or if that's temporary, and then what actually comes after Sakahàn, because I hope that they don't think that, okay, well, we did the native Aboriginal Indigenous box tick.
Yeah.
And then it's like, and from there on, it's like, non-Indigenous people onwards. It's like, you guys had your share, you guys had your blankets, now shut up. So I welcome the response from the institution if possible.
Okay, well, that will be my pleasure and my burden. In answer to the first part of your question, which is really excellent, and I thank you so much for asking it. The next exhibition that will take place is actually a historical Canadian show. It's an exhibition that will look at and is innovative in a very real way as well. It's reframing history of the early arts in Canada, the development of it, in a way that is actually broadening it beyond the recognized fine arts of painting and sculpture. So it's bringing into the fold the influence that architects had, that design had, and creating a better understanding that isn't narrow in terms of the early development of art in Canada after settlement. Okay, in answer to your second question, what's next? Sakahàn is the first of a 5-year cycle of exhibitions. So no, it's not a checklist. This is really actually a moment of momentum that has been building and will be propelled forward into the future. In fact, some of the upcoming shows are solo exhibitions of Indigenous artists. Greg and I will both switch tracks to do some in-depth solo exhibitions of artists at the same time that we will continue to work on the next quinquennial. Now, in answer to your third point about the galleries downstairs, and I really thank you for bringing this up. It is problematic, there's no doubt about it. It's very complex. The hierarchy you mention in terms of the location within a gallery setting is so valid, and we can't be ignorant to that. And I think, in fact, the position of the Inuit Art Galleries, which is a permanent collection exhibition space, so it's our permanent collection, but we change it every year. And we do experimental, we try experimental approaches to presenting the art form. So it's also, because of its autonomy, if you want, being isolated, we've had some liberty to actually do things differently there than we might have done on the main floor where the galleries are all united one after the other. But that's just one benefit. Maybe I'll say the plus first. Another is that we have questioned Inuit artists when they've come to visit and other community members how they feel about it. And they actually, for the most part, have said they like the idea that there is a space for the Inuit art history and the development of their visual arts to be shown in a very comprehensive way. So they appreciate that we've devoted a space to this art form. The real problem is the location, as you say, on the lower level, and that it is off of the main path. So it almost seems like this art form developed in isolation when, even if Inuit lived in the north and in the 50s and 60s didn't travel very widely, their art was not isolated. You walk down a street in Toronto on Yonge Street and you saw Riopel and you saw Karoo-Ashevak. And by having them separated, it's almost like we're saying they didn't have any influence or relationship to the story of Canadian art history at large. So, but I can tell you it's changing. The reason the galleries are there is because we did not collect Inuit art for a number of years. And when this building was designed, we did not have a collection that we thought we would need to display permanently. So it is definitely an afterthought that we have tried to make the best of, but it is changing. We have already started making plans towards having Inuit art within the main floor of Canadian art. So the flow will be there, and hopefully we will still be able to maintain a section which tells their distinctive development at a very crucial time in Canadian art history. So you wanted to?
If I may, briefly, I think that the location of the Inuit galleries has been a thorn in the side of the institution for a long time, and if I may speak not as a representative of the institution, but as an artist, as Greg Hill, who's not a curator. Yes, I think Christine's being overly apologetic because it's actually something that she's been in the position to defend since those galleries have been there, and that's not. And there's a lot more happening with the representation and presentation and collecting of Inuit art in this institution that isn't being recognized when we just look at the location of the galleries and interpret them as being, in the basement, when actually you can reframe it and look at it in a different way and say, well, and why do we give into hierarchies? Why don't we reorder the hierarchy and say, well, Inuit galleries are the basis of the representation of art at the National Gallery of Canada. They're on the ground floor, and then you move to other galleries. But apart from that, and that might be a bit glib, but what's really happening is the artwork is being shown there in a very cohesive way, but it's also being shown in the Canadian galleries, works by Inuit artists, from historical works to the end of the Canadian galleries, which is in the 1980s, and also in the contemporary galleries. And if you haven't noticed, Inuit artists have a very strong presence in Sakahàn. And this is something that's continuing. It's part of what we're doing in reframing the Department of Indigenous Art, which includes Inuit art. There was a lot of resistance to that idea from some who felt that they were losing something by losing a curatorial position that was dedicated wholly and completely to Inuit art. And yet we think that we're bringing this important field of art, these important artists together with us, because there's a much larger dialogue that and a much larger conversation that all of this is part of, and I think we all agree in that. So I think that needs to be said as well. But thank you, Shigeyuki, for bringing it up, because it is important and it has to be. It's not something that we don't want to talk about.
Hi, my name is Greg Stotts. Yeah, I think the cognitive container crisis of both of those terminologies of Indigenous and what Robert was saying, I too am sort of on the fence with that, because at one point, prior to 1926, where I grew up on Six Nations, after the federal government split our reserve into the band council system, there was a cognitive shift in terms of where you lived, the upper enders and the down belowers, and of course the upper enders being the Christianized, and the down belowers being traditional longhouse. So the resistance to those terms and to that container theory has always been there with me, and I, because I've had it placed on me and had all these other, I've seen all these other machinations of terminology throughout, the white paper and throughout history but I don't think you can actually, it's like putting a, life experience in a container. It's not, it's very disrespectful. So, but also at the same point, on the flip side, or on the other side of the fence, is the fact that we do have this term does, in fact, describe a shared almost an invitation, and also our desire to look at who we and where we came from, and that is a part of us as well. So, as well as the life experience. So that's all I want to say.
I'll touch briefly on the indigeneity thing. Briefly, it's basically part of the classification system that the colonial structures force us to participate in. The whole concept of Western art, like the idea of putting artworks on walls and that's been adopted pretty much around the world. So, as an art practice, like of collecting arts and putting them in your home, that's now a worldwide thing. So, Western art is, and it being called Western art, this brings into the next question, which is the crisis in Western art is a thing called China. Now, we all know that art follows money. Now, the art world is going to be, it's going to be essentially Chinese, going into the future. So we've seen just in a forerunner of this, about 3 weeks ago, some little bit of porcelain sold for $9 million. So we're on the way. They've got way more money than the Americans. So it doesn't matter how shiny Jeff Koons makes his art, he ain't going to get more than what the Chinese are going to be getting. So Western art is actually a sinking ship. Rather than us, rearranging, the chairs on the deck of that sinking ship, we should be looking at floating another boat. So, and I'm serious about that. This thing is sinking. Western art, is made essentially by 10% of the world's population. Now that's a fact. And you go into all these institutions here. There's a feminist curator from America. She examined the collections, in shows at the MoMA, the Met, the Whitney, the Tate Modern, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And she found that in all but the Whitney, where they had 73% white male, 26% white female, and 1% for the rest of the world, the 90%. But in the others, it was 95% white male, 4% white female, and 1% for the rest of us. So I'm a numbers man, and that tells me that 90% of the work in those collections is shit. So, unless you get rid of that fucking shit, and bring bring the gallery up from Darky's Corner down in the bottom and put us right there at the opening. When they walk in that door, what they see is the stuff, the good stuff, you know. And the other crisis for Western art is that they better start making some good art.
I'm hoping that someone will answer Richard's question at some point of what this boat looks like. Is this? Oh, Vernon wants to. Do you have an answer? Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah, Vernon Aki, that's true, brother, everything you said. Just in case you don't know. As Christine was talking about the crisis in Western art, which Richard so eloquently addressed, I just had a thought that, maybe it's just that there's no crisis in Western art. Maybe, or maybe Western art is always in crisis, and this is just our time. You know, maybe this is how long it takes for white fellas to give us a go. You know, so maybe there's there's just less crisis in Indigenous art or art of indigeneity, Robert. And maybe we just become stronger for it, or getting back to a crisis in Western art, maybe Western art is becoming less interesting, and the world in its global state is looking for more, looking for art of substance made by people of substance.
I have this problem when people say Western art and trying to define it and stuff, because it's not just Western art, it's also Asian art. And every other kind of art form that Indigenous people have to live with. So I just wanted to say that.
I just wanted to say, I think Western art's always been in crisis. But one of the things that we perhaps need to do is, as you mentioned, we need to redefine our art for ourselves and take it back. So, for example, today we always hear this term Māori modernism. So we're talking about a generation from the 50s that supposedly owe everything to Picasso. I always thought it was the other way around, and I grew up thinking that Picasso owed everything to the Africans and to oceanic art. So why can't we reframe them as the European Māoris? Or why can't we just turn the frame of reference around instead of always taking on those terms and having to defend ourselves?
So we're building a boat, and here's what, we're already building a boat. Everybody here is building a boat, but the part of what happens is Western art consumes the Western world consumes constantly, continually our land, our language, our arts, et cetera, and we're at risk of being consumed by that machine, even as leaders of Indigenous art and doing work in that vein. So every one of us here that's creating is a leader building this boat, but how are you going to keep that boat on the right course? I don't know. Is that our job to keep it on the right course?
Speaking of boats, if I could interject.